Tap into a whole new world of financial possibilities. Genie, get it to get it.
The Sri Lankan economy, a reality check of which is vital for any entrepreneur or a business decision maker. Here in Bisnomics, as your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes, we intend to deliver that reality check to you in whatever possible frequency so that you can make the informed decisions with better insight. I'm Tharandu Amarasekara, and joining me for today's discussion is the Senior Research Fellow at Advocata and the former Director of the Central Bank, Dr. Roshan Perera. Dr. Roshan, welcome to Bisnomics. Absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much for having me on this program.
Doctor, let's get to the real problem that people are asking about, the cost of living. It's not just increasing, it's spiraling. In fact, it's coming to a level where people are concerned, can we really afford to live a normal life with the salary we are getting even? And these concerns are echoing in the social and business forums. Businesses are wondering, how can we manage our costs? My question to you, how exactly is this inflation measured beyond the hearsay and beyond the normal discussions we have in general conversations that prices are rising? How is it measured, number one? Number two, how are the numbers looking? Is it as bad as the numbers are showing, or is it worse? Demystify this for us.
Okay, so I think first explain what is the inflation or what. So inflation is really a continuous increase in price changes. So it's not just prices increasing, but there is a continuous increase in prices. And when does inflation become a problem? When it affects it becomes uncertain, or it creates uncertainty in the minds of both consumers and producers, and it affects their decision making. But it is generally accepted that if you have a low and stable inflation rate, and a predictable inflation, it is good for the economy because it basically stimulates economic activity. So your next question is really, how do we measure inflation? We generally use a consumer price index, and in Sri Lanka we have two. It's the Colombo Consumer Price Index and the National Consumer Price Index. If you look at those numbers right now, that is, we have the numbers for September. The CCPI was about 5.7. The National Consumer Price Index was about 6.7. And looking at that against the central bank's range within which they want to keep inflation, which is about 4 to 6%, it doesn't look that bad, right? But what we have to keep in mind is those inflation numbers don't necessarily take into account, or don't take into account, the recently the changes or the removal of price controls on a lot of administered products, which will have a one-off effect at least on the inflation rate. The thing is, why I'm saying one-off is, if it's only a one-off increase, it'll pass through the inflation, and it hopefully won't have an impact on other commodities or goods and services. And that is the thing that needs to be managed really, because if you allow those price increases to feed into inflation expectations, it'll affect public expectations for further increases of inflation, which will be self-fulfilling. And then finally, it'll, as you said, it'll basically inform or feed into your wage negotiations in the next round, and then basically all prices will start increasing. But for me, actually, what I would say the bigger concern is actually the increase in money supply, because what we have seen is the central bank has been printing money to finance the budget deficit. Money supply has been growing at something like 21%, and I think we've all heard this phrase, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. That was said by Milton Friedman. So I think that is where the real concern is, that we need to make sure, or the central bank really needs to make sure, that it has a tight rein over the money supply, because that could lead to demand-driven inflation, which is pervasive. That will basically increase all prices.
This money is printed to be given as unemployment benefits to people. What's the exact purpose? Yes, they want to to close that budget deficit, and so once they print this money, what's the next step? How does it actually get utilized, doctor?
So basically what happens is, because the government's revenue, or how much it's earning, is less than how much it is spending,
it's using the money for that.
It is basically bridging that deficit. So it goes to various sources, right? Depending on what the government spends on, it will be used to finance those expenditures. So I think this is which is the most important thing, that the central bank needs to have a tight rein over that. and use the tools that it has, which is basically the interest rate, to make sure that money supply is kept under check. And this really, what is important is also the credibility of the central bank, because that is what will ensure that people's expectations of inflation rising in the future are managed.
Doctor, now basic economics say that inflation is a sign to the fact that the economy is somewhat growing, and inflation is not necessarily a bad thing, more like a side product of economic growth sometimes. Of course, it can be due to a supply side shock as well. But the key word here is making sure it's at a low, stable and manageable level. Am I correct?
Exactly, exactly. So that is where the central banks, the mandates of central banks around the world have been really to focus on inflation and keeping it at this low and stable level. And what they found is by doing that, they can actually make sure that that economic growth is more sustainable. It is it is kept at a stable level, or a level at which the economy it benefits more people in the more citizens in the population. Understood. So that is really the key mandate of a central bank.
And when the inflation is rising on a month-on-month basis, as we see now, people will also start demanding for higher wages, and that in return gets kind of a snowball rolling, isn't it, with price increases everywhere?
Exactly. So that's why I said that the central bank is key, really. So you can't do this through administered prices. I don't think that is the way to control inflation, because it has failed. We have seen that it has failed in the past. So I don't think
even in the recent times.
Even in recent times, because at some point it has to be adjusted.
Correct. Or people go to the black markets.
Exactly. So that is really not a way to control inflation. The key really to controlling inflation is making sure that money supply is kept at a level which is consistent with the growth in the economy, or which allows the economy to grow, but not where it generates inflation which is excessive, which as we say creates uncertainty to the agents in the economy, like the consumers and the producers.
Understood. Now, Doctor, we recently saw about these regulated prices. For example, they tried to bring in a regulated price for paddy, for rice. Now, we saw how some of these big suppliers very openly saying, try to do it if you can. And finally, the government had to pull back. They tried sending their agents to various supply sources, trying to control things. But then finally, the government had to admit and say, no, look, you know what, we are getting out of it. And kind of the entire price control is now with some of the businesses. Is this not a total economic failure on the government side?
So I have to say that governments try to use these price controls for various economic and social reasons.
And political reasons as well.
Yeah, so basically what they're trying to do, their main objective is to protect the vulnerable consumers in society or households and to subsidize them, particularly in terms of the cost of these essential goods. But this price controls is very, combined with these subsidies really, is a very inefficient way of doing this, of addressing inequality, because what we generally find is that subsidies really benefit the rich consumer more than the poor. So it's actually, it is pro-rich really, because the rich consume more of these goods than the poor. For example, if you take the fuel subsidies that we have, we all enjoy, studies have shown that actually a disproportionate number of rich or a larger share of the subsidy goes to the rich, because they consume a disproportionate share of the fuel subsidy. So as you can see, it's not really a way in which you can address or help the really poor in the society. And also by preventing companies from adjusting prices, what does it, or having these price controls, what does it end up with? You end up with shortages, rationing, and ultimately, as you said, it ends up in a black market. And we have seen that, right? We have had first-hand experience with all the recent, price controls and the gazettes that have been issued. And ultimately, what has happened, as you said, you have had to remove it. In addition to that, actually, when these price controls are on commodities that are supplied by government or government-owned institutions like fuel subsidies, it ends up being a huge burden on the government's finances, because when they are, producing or supplying these at a loss, ultimately the government has to subsidize this, right? So
Which means people's tax money.
Exactly. So you're transferring money from, from some worthwhile use. So basically, you're using, money that should have gone for some other
Like
good, health or education, and you're using it to subsidize people who really don't need the subsidy, right? So I think a better way to really handle this is to allow competition, and this is where I think government policy needs to change. Particularly, you talked about rice policy. I mean, in a lot of the things that all the commodities that we're talking about, there are monopolies or oligopolies. We need to have much more competition because that will really increase production and give the benefit to the consumer, because then there'll be, there'll be more competitive pricing.
Correct.
And a better way to really handle the equity issue and the distribution issue is to give cash transfers to people who really need it.
Like what Hong Kong did recently as well.
Exactly. Instead of these blanket subsidies which benefit all society, of the whole of society, you should just give targeted cash transfers
Especially
to
the
people.
low-income earners.
Exactly, for people, poor households. And that is a much better way, and it will be a much more efficient way of transferring resources to people who really need it.
Doctor, the talk of the town is the hike of the gas prices. Was somewhat at a massive level. I don't think we've ever seen something like that before, of that amount. Now, isn't this a sign that our future energy supply is under threat? The energy security of this nation is being questioned as a result of this. And apart from giving subsidies, is there any other strong alternative for the government?
So what I have to say is Sri Lanka is not the only country facing these, high cost of fuel and energy prices, and also the shortages.
Even UK and the EU is having the same issue.
Exactly. They are all international prices of fuel and gas have actually risen very sharply recently. And just to put it into context, what we need to understand is when the COVID-19 crisis struck, there was a sharp decline in all these prices because of the lockdowns and people, a lot of activity just shrank. It drove down a lot of these fuel and gas prices to the lowest level actually in decades.
Though in Sri Lanka we did not see any such reduction.
Yes, exactly. So I'll come to that actually. So the shortages we are experiencing today is both actually due to the demand factors and supply factors, because demand is now economic activity is rebounding in many of these countries. Yes. Exactly. So obviously demand is also for these energy for energy has increased. On the other hand, supply is tight because the capacity has not been increased because of the low prices.
Correct.
The people have not, the countries have not invested in capacity. So there is it's a double whammy really. But as you said, on the domestic front, what we are seeing is also again to do with controlled prices. Because if prices were allowed to adjust in the market, it can adjust both ways. And as you said, last year when international prices were low, consumers could have benefited. And now, yes, consumers have to pay more. But that's the thing, you have to allow the market mechanism to work. And so that consumers benefit from at both ends. And what happens is then there's a gradual adjustment of prices. Consumers are not shocked when you suddenly increase prices in a high way, at a high rate. There's a gradual adjustment, so they can either use substitutes or they can change their consumption patterns. So I think here, you were asking what can be done. I think what needs to be done is you need to allow more competition, allow other players into the market. So in the gas market, we have only two players, right? So you need to allow other people to come into the market and remove the barriers of entry so that you can foster more competition. And as I said, that way you can keep the prices more competitive.
Thank you for those thoughts, Doctor. We don't hear much talk about the dollar crisis. So does it mean it's solved? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics.
Tap into a whole new world of financial possibilities. Genie, get it to get it.
Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Our focus is a reality check on the Sri Lankan economy, and we are in conversation with Dr. Roshan Perera. Dr. Roshan, now let's talk about the import-export trade gap. Now we hear so much of talk about exports being more than $1 billion on a month-on-month basis, which is somewhat unprecedented in the past. So clearly there's a kind of a good news there. And at the same time, we have also cut down on a lot of the imports. For example, vehicle imports are not allowed yet, and we also see that imports are restricted on so many different items. But still, the pain doesn't seem to be reducing. We are not seeing the currency strengthening, and we just don't see any light at the end of this tunnel. What are your thoughts on that?
So you're right. I think exports have done tremendously, and I think that's because of this pickup in economic, global economic growth. But as you said, if you look at the latest data coming out from the central bank, that is data up to July, the trade data, the trade balance, or that's the difference between the exports and imports, has actually widened.
Yes.
And this is in spite of import restrictions. But that's not to say the import restrictions haven't worked, because consumer goods, where motor vehicles are part of consumer goods, have grown at a slower rate. That has slowed down. The problem has been that consumer goods only account for about 20% of total imports. The bulk of it, 60%, are intermediate goods, and other 20% approximately are investment goods.
So when you say when you say intermittent goods or intermediate goods, that's basically what we use to add value to whatever we export, etc.
Exactly, and the big component is fuel there. So, and what we have seen is fuel prices have been rising. So naturally, we see a huge increase in fuel imports, or the cost of fuel imports, which has led to this widening of the trade gap.
Were we not long-term enough in our thinking, especially last year when oil was at a near zero, where some governments were almost at a level of giving money to take the oil and go? Were we not long-term enough to buy a bulk stock and have things ready for the winter time, or rather for the time that the prices will be rising?
So unfortunately, Sri Lanka does not have enough storage capacity. That is a huge issue. That has been an issue for some time, and we have not invested enough in that. So that is definitely all, we can do forward contracts and buy forward, but then, we have had issues with that as well.
Correct.
But
we betted on the wrong side of the forward agreement.
Yes, but that is not to say that those agreements are bad. I mean, if you enter into them in a proper way, actually they can be beneficial to a country. And as you said, when prices are declining, we can actually benefit from those. So I think those are some things that the country really needs to look at, because it's a management. It's management of our resources. But secondly, again, we come back to the point of control prices. We have control prices on fuel. So people don't understand. You don't change your behavior. You don't change the way how much you use, because for people, when the prices increase or decrease, you basically pay the same amount domestically.
So we are kind of shielded, at least artificially.
Exactly, which is a wrong policy if you are trying to, if your prices are really being determined internationally. So I think there we really need to have this pricing mechanism to work, and I think there was an automatic pricing formula that was proposed. I mean, these are things that really need to be looked at again and introduced. I mean, we've talked about this for many years, but I think these are serious issues that need to be taken into consideration. The other thing is basically our industries are basically dependent on raw material imports. Most of our industries import raw materials. So I don't think the issue, and having restrictions on imports has restricted their production, and has a huge negative impact on a lot of our domestic industries. So I don't think the issue is how much we import or what we import, but what we do with our imports. Because if we are adding value to imports and we are exporting those imports, then that's well and good. We have less to worry about. Or if it's improving our productive capacity by we are importing investment goods, and hopefully through FDI, again, there's not much to be worried about, because basically it's increasing our productive capacity. So I don't think we should be imposing these across-the-board restrictions, because basically, finally, that will have an impact on our future.
Boomerang back to us.
Exactly, our future growth prospects.
And at the same time, when we block other countries' imports, they'll block our exports. Retaliation.
You'll have retaliatory, trade wars. Basically, will ensue. And further, it actually increases cost of production by having these barriers, like by having import controls, because you're increasing your cost of production. And also, it's not benefiting the consumer, because the consumer is ending up having to pay a higher price for products. So I think what we really need to do is to develop, the whole point is we need to develop our domestic industries. But that is not by having, these artificial import controls. We need to improve productivity and efficiency of those industries.
I'm sure you have also seen in some homes or when some families come out to have dinner, there's that one child who is crying and refusing to stop crying. Doctor, is the current dollar crisis and this exchange rate crisis that problem child of the Sri Lankan economy? Because yes, it might not be getting highlighted as it was a few months back, but I don't think that the problem has gone away. And you and I both can agree, because we are reporting to the public of this country, that the current dollar rate is heavily artificially being controlled. It's nowhere near the actual rate. That's why you can't really go and get dollars at the way you want at that rate. So my question to you is, what can be done to really make this problem go away? What's the answer to this problem? Now, exports are also rising, but still, we don't see this problem getting solved.
So let me move back a little bit and tell you, okay, because the country has a certain amount of foreign exchange in the country, and that we measure through our foreign reserves.
And I believe by now they say it's gone to minus levels.
So it's about 2.5 billion as at in September. Of course, we don't know what has, in this month, we might have had certain outflows. But that is enough to only finance 1.5 months of imports, which is very little. And unless there are some large
even
inflows,
after all these vehicle imports are restricted, is it despite those?
Exactly. So maybe yes, exactly. So that is kind of the amount of foreign reserves that we have in the country to do, pay our debt service payments and whatever dollars, other payments that need to be made within the economy. So unless there are large inflows into the country, we are going to have a problem, because the issue is in the next 12 months, we have something like $7 billion worth of debt service payments. I think that is where the issue has been. In the past, because we had a better credit rating, we were able to refinance or, roll over this debt.
Correct.
The problem now is we are unable to roll over this debt, and as a result, the government or the central bank has had to start repaying this debt.
And correct me if I'm wrong, we have also been rated at a junk level, our government bonds.
Yeah, so we are CCC rated, which means that we don't have access to financial markets.
And the next level is D, delinquent.
So if
am I right?
Yes. So I mean, we have not gone there yet.
Yes.
But
let's hope not.
Yes, exactly. But the problem is basically we can't roll over these debts. So which means that we have been using our reserves to pay these debts, and that's not a very efficient way of using our foreign reserves, because foreign reserves really need to be there to strengthen the economy, to give confidence to investors to come into the economy, and basically it should be used only in, say, if there's some shock.
Nobody likes to give money to anyone who doesn't have any money.
Exactly. So we need to maintain those reserves. That's a huge cost to the economy, because you're basically using your reserves for debt service payments. On the other hand, you're restricting other activities in the economy by restricting your imports, which will really actually generate more productive activity. Then you also talked about the peg of the US dollar, or maintaining a fixed exchange rate. I mean, basically that again is a price control. We talked about price controls, and we know exactly what happens when you control prices. You have rationing, you have shortages, you have black market, which is what you talked about. Basically, those are exactly what you're seeing in the exchange rate
and the
market.
banks are saying, doctor, but the banks say we don't have dollars to give.
So if you are pegging your rate at an unrealistic rate,
unless it's low rate,
exporters who have hard-earned money, why should they exchange it at that rate? Or if you are a worker who work, it's a hard-earned money that you earn outside. Why would you exchange it at an unrealistic rate?
But they are saying, you should think about the country.
Well, yes, you should think about the country, but then this is money that they have earned from in their own capacity, right?
Absolutely.
So
not that the government had anything to do with that.
Exactly. So they should be allowed to exchange it at the proper market price. So you're creating more shortages or more rationing by having this artificially low rate. And there are other consequences of an overvalued exchange rate, because basically you're creating an anti-export bias and an import bias, because imports become cheaper, exports become more expensive, and you'll end up actually worsening the trade deficit.
For sure.
So let me actually read you something that was written by the central bank. This was sometime in 2016, in December. This is what they say. They said, therefore, maintaining a stable exchange rate against the US dollar cannot be considered as a sustainable approach, since this would lead to an overvaluation of the Sri Lankan rupee, which would in turn reduce the competitiveness of our exports.
For sure.
At the same time, Sri Lanka does not have the capacity to intervene on a continuous basis through the supply of foreign currency due to the fact that the country has only a limited amount of international reserves. Using reserves accumulated through borrowed funds to defend the exchange rate is even more costly to the economy. Depreciation of the exchange rate has a positive impact on the country's trade deficit as it makes imports more expensive for the domestic consumer and exports cheaper to foreigners. Now, this was written in 2016.
Basic economic sense.
So, what has changed since then? Aren't we in the same economic environment? Don't we have the same issues?
We do.
So, I hope the central bank goes back and looks at the fundamentals.
And what you're saying is that threatening the banks to keep the rate artificially low is not a sustainable strategy.
Well, we've seen that with commodity prices, and this is also another price. It's a price of foreign exchange, foreign currency.
For sure.
And the same is going to happen there.
Doctor, for a long time, the viewpoint always used to be, even if we are unable to really manage these economic matters, there's at least food to eat. Fertilizer ban has kind of added, that conundrum has added to the current mess. What are your thoughts on the economic impact of that? If you could take 2 minutes and just share your viewpoint with us.
So again, it's a case of price control. I mean, when you have...
We keep coming back to that, don't we?
It's the price controls again. You have given a large number, you were trying to give a large number of farmers fertilizer at a subsidized rate. What was the impact? It was not sustainable because you had a huge fiscal cost and it had a huge impact on the import expenditure, right?
Yeah.
So in 2019, basically, I think the government spent something like 46 billion on the fertilizer imports. And similarly, they had a huge import bill. It's much better to allow the market to operate because then it will be much more efficient in allocating fertilizer to those who need it most.
But given that agriculture is an essential item, don't you think some kind of subsidizing and support has to come in?
But this has to be done in a very, very carefully. Again, I don't think you should subsidize the fertilizer itself. Again, what you should do is maybe give a cash transfer.
To the farmers.
To the farmers who really need it. Because here what was happening was, even a rich person who owned acres of paddy land was also entitled to the same fertilizer.
Yeah, sometimes free fertilizer.
Exactly. So, there's no point in subsidizing the commodity. It's better to give a cash transfer to farmers who really need it, who are the poorest farmers, and not just have across-the-board subsidy. And just to add to this about the organic fertilizer, I think that is something that really needs to, I don't think there was much study put into it. There was not much thought given to it, because I think there are a lot of experts, so I'm not an expert in agriculture, but I know the experts have said that it's going to have a huge impact on productivity, particularly rice and tea, which is going to have a huge impact on our food security and even our foreign exchange earnings. And particularly in this current juncture where you have seen international prices of grains and food prices are going up, I think this is a very ill-advised policy, and I hope that
wrong move at the wrong time.
I hope that will be looked at carefully.
The budget is coming up. What should we expect? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics. We are in conversation with Dr. Roshan Perera, doing a reality check of the current economic situation of the nation. Dr. Roshan, the budget, highlight of everyone. Of course, people are wondering, well, they have a budget every year, but then they keep changing things so many times. Is it really even worth spending time and listening and analyzing the budget? But let's still go with some belief in this budget for now. With the budget coming up, I believe in November, what are the key highlights that are expected?
So at Advocata, we actually did a framework for economic recovery. And I think there we highlighted 3 main areas that we hope the budget will focus on. The first is actually to address the macroeconomic imbalances that we're seeing in the economy. Because Sri Lanka has been, for many decades, a twin deficit economy, right? We've had the fiscal deficit, we have a current account deficit in the external sector. But that, it is getting worse, it's worsening. and it's worsening all because it has impacts on all our other variables like our exchange rate, our interest rates, as we were discussing all this time. So I think that really needs to be addressed, and particularly the fiscal deficit, because I think that is very much a part of the budget. They need to really manage that fiscal deficit, and there I think the policy I think they really need to focus on is tax policies, because we have had ad hoc changes in tax policies over very many times. There needs to be really close analysis and fixing of this tax system. Secondly, of course, we can't do anything without growth. So I think the budget also needs to focus on how to stimulate growth. And there I think it's really by improving our competitiveness and our productivity. So because growth shouldn't be just, growth that benefits some, but it should be more inclusive growth. It should be sustainable growth. That is, it should be able to be maintained over a long period of time.
Like what we've seen in countries like South Korea, where as the entire economy grew, they pulled even the ones who were in the doldrums of income levels, at the lowest level, they were pulled out of poverty. And today we recognize it as a gold medal nation. In Ruchir Sharma, I believe, the breakout nations.
Exactly. So I think those are good models really that we need to look at.
Correct.
Because we need to have more sustainable growth, because we've had spurts of high growth, debt fuel growth based on say infrastructure spending, but it has never been sustainable. After a few years, we have gone back to a very low rate of growth. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the economists or the economic experts such as yourself, you'll use a particular measurement. Is it the Gini coefficient or? For income inequality?
Inequalities, yeah, that is a Gini coefficient. And in Sri Lanka, I believe it has been increasing.
Okay. Which is not good.
It is not good.
The more you are closer to one, that shows extreme inequality.
Inequality, exactly. So I think we really need to focus on sort of broad-based growth that will benefit all the citizens, as many citizens as possible, and not just a few people. And but as we do, as we focus on growth, you will see that there'll be some people who might fall through the cracks, and that's where we need to build buffers. We need to have safety nets to protect people who might get left behind. And I think this pandemic has really shown the need for safety nets, because there were so many households, I think, were affected very badly. You had workers, particularly self-employed workers, who lost their jobs or lost their income earning capacity. But because we didn't have enough fiscal space, we were constrained, the government was constrained to be able to help these people or to support them for over because this has been a long period, right? It's been nearly 2 years of the pandemic. So I think that's the third thing, that the budget must focus on building these safety nets or building these buffers, so that if there's an economic shock like the pandemic, we have the resources to be able to protect those people from, and that's what many countries did around the world, right? They had these cash transfers made for many months.
Correct.
To people, and that is one reason why those countries are now coming out, because they've been able to stimulate spending and get the economy back on track.
Doctor, what economic sectors, now I understand your analysis, but from the looks of things, what sectors can we expect to receive a boost from the upcoming budget? And most importantly, let's talk about tourism. Now, that has been one of the key foreign income earners for Sri Lanka, and we can clearly see the impact of not having a good tourism rebounds. Because if you take countries like Seychelles, more island nations, where I believe it's easier to isolate and separate those who are contracted with COVID and those who don't, we see a massive rebounds in their tourism sector. In fact, the Seychelles rupee in the recent weeks is showing a year-to-date growth of more than 60%, making it the best performing currency in the world so far in terms of the bounce back and the appreciation. So how do you see tourism being supported by the upcoming budget, and any other sectors which you think can be supported?
So what I'd like to say is, I think policymakers or technocrats are not the best person to pick winners. Which sectors should be given a boost. because that is really a market decision, and we should allow the entrepreneur, the businessman, because they have a much better sense of what would really benefit work exactly. So I think the role of a government is really to facilitate this private sector activity. They should really address whatever weaknesses, hindrances are in the economy, and facilitate investment and growth. So I would be little reluctant to give
it to A and don't give it to B.
Exactly. You rather create that environment, and then you let the private sector to decide what is the most productive area to invest in. So in that sense, I think the budget, I hope, will have some things in it to basically improve the business environment, because we have so many regulatory barriers that prevent businesses from really doing well or taking off, or even new businesses from emerging. So I hope those are some of the things that will be addressed.
We were not ranked very highly in the Ease of Business report of the World Bank. Having said that, Doctor, the World Bank Ease of Business report, I believe, has been discontinued now because they found that the report was unfairly favoring certain nations such as China.
Yes, so yes, that's correct. But I think we shouldn't just throw the baby with the bathwater. I think there are some good things about the report or this kind of index. And yes, Sri Lanka did fare very poorly compared to a lot of our peers.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that it's a bad index.
Yes.
I think that's something that we can aspire to. We should have aspired to improve that index, and not just the index, to improve the metrics really.
Correct.
Because
it did shed some light on what we need to work on.
Yes. So I think there's a good thing there, but we really need to work hard on those. I mean, we've been talking about this for many years. So and we're all wondering, why doesn't FDI come into this country? It's because of these things. The other issue is land. There's a study that was done, extensive study, and found that the availability of land was a huge issue.
Not enough land available, or it's not accessible.
Accessible, because land is available, but it's not accessible to investors. So when an investor wants to come in and start a project, he has to go through, or he or she has to go through so much of hoops just to try and get the land availability.
Understood.
There are labor issues, the flexibility of labor. I mean, it's very costly to hire labor in Sri Lanka. So that has prevented this flexibility in the labor market. And also we have some infrastructure gaps. I know we've spent a lot of infrastructure, but maybe not the right infrastructure. So I think some of these
highways are not the only infrastructure that matters.
Exactly. So we need to be very mindful that what we invest in gives us the highest social and economic returns. So we need to really think carefully about what we invest in terms of infrastructure. So I hope the budget would adjust. These are kind of our thinking.
And we respect your thinking, Doctor. And in terms of the budget of the country, now it's the balance between the income and expense. And one very big expense for the government is the public sector expenditure. In fact, a lot of analysis shows that most of the government income does get spent back on the public sector, their salaries, maintaining the public sector, etc. Do you believe that the public sector expenditures of this country carries, especially the government sector expenses, has a massive burden on the country's finances? And what do you think can be done differently?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. Basically, contractual obligations like interest payments, salaries and wages and pensions account for 2/3 of our entire government expenditure, which leaves very little
to spend on the country.
On everything else. So health, education, or your capital expenditure, everything else gets a very small share. So I think definitely, even our report, we basically highlighted that there needs to be very strict oversight and control of government expenditure, and a rationalization of public sector, the public sector itself. Rationalizing recruitment, enhancing productivity, because it becomes a drag on the rest of the country as well, right? Because the wages that are set here basically is like a reservation wage for all other wages in the country. And if you speak to anybody, everybody wants to get a job in the government sector, because of course you're guaranteed your salary, you're guaranteed your pension, and sometimes it's very often, particularly at lower levels, it's higher than wages that you get outside. So it is a disincentive for people to even want to work in
maybe want to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So,
So,
Dr. Roshan, what you are suggesting is rationalizing the government mechanisms. For example, we know that some of our authorities, for example, some of the public sector organizations have way too much staff than what is required. But removing them, this kind of an action is more like something that could even end up in a change of government.
So I'm not suggesting, I don't think you can remove, because we have very strict, our labor laws are very difficult. But I think going forward, I think what happens is every year we have a large new recruitments.
Correct.
I think we need to start reducing on that, or reducing or stop recruitment into the public sector. Freeze recruitments, and maybe increase your, even, I think they've even talked about that, raising the retirement age, because, or actually that might have
other repercussions.
But I think definitely you have to freeze the recruitment into the government sector to address this.
Because I am aware for a fact, for example, if you look at in China, when they were shifting from more of a socialist economy to being one which embraced capitalism to a certain extent, they laid off a population of people which is close to that of entire France. But of course, given that they operate on a one-party system, it was easy now. In Sri Lanka, given it's a more democratic situation, I think what you're saying could lead to certain social and even political repercussions, but it's the right thing to do, without making the government sector more efficient. What you're saying is we can't expect any sustainable economic stance. Is that correct?
Exactly, and because I think it's becoming a drag on the rest of the country, because many of the private sector, if you talk to the private sector, and particularly factories, they find it very difficult to hire labor, because it's difficult to get people to employment. But if your country wants to improve, if you want to grow, we need to be able to have labor available to the productive sectors of the economy. But if the government is pulling all this labor, and particularly the young people, into the public sector, we are going to lose this massive pool of labor, which is necessary for real productive growth, and for the private sector to grow, which is necessary for economic growth overall.
Some government entities, though, they have adopted more of a self-sustaining business model, but that's just a very few, isn't it?
Yes, I mean,
very limited.
Very limited. So that is mainly because if you might have some restrictions on how you recruit, very good training, but those are very limited number of institutions.
Understood. Dr. Roshan Perera, thank you so much for spending your valuable time and joining us today to shed light on so many different facets of the economy. I believe the entire audience would have benefited from the thoughts and insights you shared, and the key takeaway that I got is price control is something that is artificial, that is not sustainable for a long-term economic success. Thank you so much for joining us, and keep up the good work you're doing. Wish you good luck.
Thank you.
A reality check of the Sri Lankan economy. This was our focus today on Bisnomics, and I'm sure no matter what business sector you may be in, these ideas shared by our special guest, Dr. Roshan Perera, would enable you to make better decisions to keep moving your business forward. I'm Tharindu Amarasekara, and I will see you with the next episode. This is your weekend's most profitable 60 Minutes Bisnomics.
Tap into a whole new world of financial possibilities. Genie, get it to get it.